The ancient Romans were brutal and violent people, and their methods of torture were often as gruesome as they were creative. Flogging was one of the most common forms of torture in ancient Rome. It was used as a punishment for a variety of crimes, including theft, assault, and insubordination. The victim was stripped naked and tied to a post. The executioner would then use a whip or flail to strike the victim's back. The whip was often made of leather or metal, and it could cause severe injuries, including lacerations, bruises, and even broken bones. Flogging was a very painful experience, and it could lead to death. Impalement was a particularly gruesome form of torture and execution. The victim was forced onto a sharp stake or spike, and the stake was then pushed through their body. Impalement was often used as a punishment for treason or other serious crimes. It was also used as a way to humiliate and terrorize enemies. The victims would usually be left on the stake until they died. The death could be very slow and painful. In some cases, the victim's body would be left on the stake for days, as a warning to others. Stretching was another form of torture that the Romans used. The victim's limbs were pulled apart, often using ropes or chains. Stretching was a very painful experience, and it could lead to dislocation, broken bones, and even death. The victim's muscles and tendons would be torn, and their skin could be ripped open. Stretching was often used as a way to force a confession or to extract information. Water torture was a particularly cruel form of torture that the Romans used. The victim was tied to a chair and placed over a tub of water. The executioner would then pour water over the victim's face until they were nearly drowned. Water torture was a very frightening experience. The victim would struggle to breathe, and they would feel like they were going to die. The executioner would often stop pouring water on the victim just when they were about to drown. This would make the victim even more terrified. Rack torture was another form of torture that the Romans used. The victim was tied to a wooden frame, and their limbs were then stretched apart. Rack torture was a very painful experience, and it could lead to dislocation, broken bones, and even death. Rack torture was so bad because it was a deliberate attempt to inflict maximum pain and suffering by dislocating the victim's joints and tearing their muscles. Scaphism was a particularly gruesome form of torture that was used in ancient Persia, but the Romans also adopted it. The victim was placed inside a hollow log or trunk, and they were then fed milk and honey. Over time, the milk and honey would ferment, attracting flies and other insects. The insects would then lay eggs in the victim's body, and the maggots would eat them alive. The victim would slowly die from a combination of starvation, infection, and exposure. Scaphism was so bad because it was a slow and agonizing death that could last for days or even weeks. Crucifixion was a particularly brutal form of execution. The victim was nailed to a cross and left to die slowly, a painful and agonizing process. The cross was usually made of wood, and it was often placed in a public place, such as the intersection of two roads. The victim's hands were nailed to the crossbar, and their feet were nailed to the vertical beam. The victim would then be left to hang there until they died of suffocation. The victim's body would often be left on the cross for days, and it would be a gruesome sight for passers-by.